Autumn came early to the hills of eastern Kentucky, painting the maple trees in fiery, brilliant shades of red and gold. The morning Caleb Turner was told to leave, the valley looked almost beautiful enough to forgive what was about to happen. Caleb stood in the dirt yard with a canvas tool bag slung over his shoulder, the same bag he'd carried since he was a teenager. Inside were a few rusted hand tools, his father's old hammer, a worn saw, and a pocket knife with the handle chipped from years of use. He was 32 years old and had never owned anything more valuable than that bag. Luke Turner, his older brother, leaned against the farmhouse door. The house had belonged to their family for 3 generations. Their father had died the previous spring, and for months nothing had changed. Caleb kept working the fields. Luke handled the selling. It felt natural. It felt fair. Then Luke married Evelyn. She came from Lexington with polished shoes, sharp opinions, and a way of looking at the farm like it was a temporary inconvenience. To her, Caleb wasn't family. He was an obstacle, a reminder that this place didn't belong to her alone. "You can't stay here anymore," Luke said, his voice tight and uneasy. "Evelyn and I need space." Caleb blinked once. "This is our home." Luke's jaw hardened. "It's my land now. Father left it to me." Evelyn appeared behind him, arms crossed, wearing a coat far too clean for farm life. "You're a grown man, Caleb," she said with carefully practiced sympathy. "You'll manage. There's work in town if you really try." Caleb looked at his brother, searching for the boy who once shared a bed with him during winter storms, the boy who taught him how to fish in the creek and read by lantern light. That boy was gone. "So that's it?" Caleb asked quietly. Luke didn't answer. He just stared at the ground. Caleb nodded once. He didn't beg. He didn't shout. Pride was the last thing he still owned. He walked past them without another word, hearing the farmhouse door close behind him, with a sound that felt final and hollow, like a coffin lid. He walked for 3 days, following no road in particular, only the instinct to put distance between himself and anyone who might recognize him. The land rose higher with each mile. Farms thinned out. Trees thickened. Nights grew colder. By the third evening, he stood on a rocky ridge and looked down at a valley so far below it seemed unreal. Smoke curled from chimneys in the distance. Warm houses, warm families. Caleb had neither. That was when he saw the opening in the cliff face. At first it looked like nothing more than a shadow behind tangled brush. But as he pushed aside the branches, a dark hollow revealed itself. A cave. He stepped inside. The air changed instantly. Outside, his breath had come out in pale clouds. Inside, the air felt unexpectedly warm, like stepping into a room that had been waiting for him. The deeper he walked, the warmer it became. Caleb stood still, confused, heart pounding. Caves were supposed to be cold. This one wasn't. The chamber widened into a space large enough to stand in. A thin stream ran along one wall. The floor was sandy and dry, and the warmth, steady, unnatural, almost gentle, wrapped around him like a blanket. For the first time since leaving the farm, Caleb felt something shift inside his chest. Not safety, not yet, but possibility. And in that quiet, glowing cave, a man who had just lost his home found the first hint that he might survive without it. Caleb spent the first night inside the cave without meaning to. He told himself he would rest for an hour and keep moving before dark. But the warmth pulled the ache from his bones, and exhaustion folded him in half. He slept on bare sand with his coat wrapped around his shoulders, listening to the faint trickle of water along the stone wall. When he woke, sunlight was cutting through the entrance in a thin golden line. His breath did not fog the air. That was wrong. It should have been cold. It was late October in the mountains. Nights were already sharp enough to bite. Caleb pushed himself up and rubbed his hands together. The cave was still warm. Not hot, just steady, quietly comfortable, like the inside of a root cellar in winter. He stepped back toward the entrance. Cold air rushed in around his boots. Then he stepped deeper again, and the warmth returned. It made no sense. He walked the chamber slowly, careful and alert, the way his father had taught him to move when he didn't understand a place yet. The cave opened into a wide pocket of stone, high enough to stand straight. The floor was mostly dry sand. A narrow stream ran along the left wall and vanished into a crack in the rock. Somewhere above him, he heard a faint whisper of air moving through stone. Caleb sat on a flat rock and watched his breath. Nothing. "This ain't right," he murmured. He stayed that day to test it. When the sun rose higher, the cave grew slightly warmer. When clouds passed, the air cooled just a little, but never turned cold. By late afternoon, he felt bold enough to take off his coat. That night, he stayed again. The second morning, he began to think. He had worked in cellars and smokehouses his whole life. He knew the ground held heat better than open air. But this was different. This felt alive. The cave seemed to breathe, slow and patient, like the mountain itself was drawing air in and pushing it out again. Caleb followed the sound of wind until he found a narrow opening near the back of the chamber, high in the rock. He couldn't reach it, but he could feel cool air drifting down from it when he held his hand up. Two openings, he realized. One low, one high. Air moved between them. He spent the next few days testing the place like a man afraid the truth might vanish if he trusted it too quickly. He left in the mornings to hunt squirrels and rabbits. He found a clear spring uphill and carried water back in his canteen. He gathered fallen branches and built a raised bed to keep himself off the damp ground. At night, he watched how the air shifted. Warm during the day, steady after sunset. The stone walls held heat the way a cast iron skillet holds fire long after the flame is gone. Caleb didn't have the words for it, but he understood the shape of it. The mountain was doing the work for him. For the first time since Luke shut the door in his face, Caleb felt something stronger than anger or shame. He felt curious. He felt useful again. He stopped thinking about where he had been pushed out from and started thinking about what he could build. If this cave stayed warm in October, what would it do in December? If the mountain could trap heat without fire, maybe he didn't need a cabin at all. Maybe he needed walls only to guide the air instead of fight it. That thought scared him. It also kept him awake. On the fifth day, snow dusted the trees above the ridge. Caleb stood at the cave entrance and watched the white settle over the forest like a warning. Winter was coming, and for the first time he didn't feel hunted by it. He stepped back into the cave, into the steady, unearned warmth, and made a decision he hadn't expected to make. He would stay. He would learn what this place was trying to teach him, and he would trust the mountain with his life. By the time November arrived, the mountain had turned quiet and hostile. The trees lost their leaves in brittle waves, and the wind cut through the ridges like a blade. Caleb worked from dawn until his fingers went numb, then retreated into the cave to warm them against the stone. He had no fire, no chimney, no stove. Everything he built had to respect the way the cave breathed. He started at the entrance. Using flat stones from the slope and thick clay from the stream bed, he built a low wall across the opening, strong enough to block wind, but not sealed tight. He left narrow gaps between the stones and fitted them with wooden shutters carved from fallen oak. When the sun hit the cliff face, he could open the vents and let warm air drift inside. When night came, he closed them halfway and kept the heat where it belonged. The back vent was harder. It sat too high for him to reach. So he stacked stones into a narrow chimney shape beneath it, guiding the flow of air upward instead of letting it scatter. The cave didn't fight him. It adjusted, like it had been waiting for someone to understand it. Inside, he built a sleeping alcove where the warmth settled thickest, and a work surface beside the stream where he cleaned game and carved wood. His hands remembered the movements even when his heart felt tired and bruised. He made bowls, spoons, and small animal figures, not to sell, but to stay sane. Snow came early that year. It came in long, heavy sheets that buried the trails and erased the path he had taken into the mountains. Down in the valleys, chimneys smoked day and night. Livestock froze in their stalls. Men burned fence posts and furniture just to keep their families alive. Caleb knew none of that yet. All he knew was that the cave did not grow cold. During the day, when pale sunlight struck the rock face, warm air flowed inside and soaked into the walls. At night, the stone gave it back slowly, the way a good cast iron pan holds heat long after the stove goes dark. The stream beside him never froze. His breath never turned white. One morning in January, he stepped outside and felt the world bite him hard. The wind screamed through the trees. Snow stood waist-high in drifts. The sky looked like iron. He went back inside and removed his coat. He lived that winter in his shirt sleeves. Some nights he lay awake listening to the storm rage across the mountain, thinking of Luke and Evelyn sitting by their fire. He wondered if they ever thought of him, if his brother felt even a flicker of guilt. The thought made his chest feel tight and heavy, so he focused on his work instead. He counted his food. He checked his vents. He trusted the stone. Weeks passed, then months. By late January, his beard had grown thick, and his hands were strong again. Loneliness pressed on him in the quiet hours, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like space. Space to breathe, space to think, space to become someone who didn't need permission to exist. One afternoon, as he shaped a piece of walnut into a small bird, he heard something new. Footsteps. He stood slowly and reached for his knife. A shadow moved across the entrance wall. Then a man's voice, rough with cold. "Hello?" Caleb stepped into view, warm air spilling out behind him into the frozen world. The stranger blinked, staring at him in disbelief. "You live in there?" the man asked. "In this weather?" Caleb nodded. The man shook his head slowly. "I thought folks were lying. They said there was a man up here who didn't need fire." Caleb looked past him at the snow-covered trees and the sky the color of steel. For the first time since winter began, the secret of the cave was no longer his alone. And the mountain that had saved him was about to change his life forever. The stranger's name was Henry Cole, a trapper who worked the high ridges every winter. He followed rumors the way other men followed roads. When he saw warm air drifting from a stone wall in the middle of a frozen mountainside, he knew the stories were true. Caleb invited him inside. Henry's shoulders dropped the moment the warmth wrapped around him. He stood there in stunned silence, turning in a slow circle, staring at the stone walls, the narrow vents, the small carved figures lined up on a shelf. "No fire," Henry said finally. "No smoke, no stove." "The mountain does the work," Caleb replied. Henry stayed for supper, rabbit stew heated on a flat stone near the stream. He talked about the valleys below, about barns collapsing under snow, and families burning through their winter wood before February had even begun. When he left the next morning, he shook his head like a man walking away from a miracle. By the end of the week, others came. Some were curious. Some were desperate. They came up the ridge wrapped in blankets and doubt, and left shaking their heads in wonder. They carried stories back down the mountain. A man living in a warm cave without fire. Then one afternoon, near the end of February, a woman appeared at the entrance. She was thin, wrapped in a patch coat, her boots split at the seams. Her hair was pulled back in a rough knot, and her face held the kind of quiet strength that came from long seasons of getting by alone. "My name's Martha Reed," she said. "Henry Cole told me about you." Caleb let her in. She sat near the stone wall, palms open to the heat, her eyes closing as if her body didn't trust the warmth yet. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but worn. "My husband died in a logging accident 3 years ago. My cabin's drafty. Chimney won't draw right. I've been sleeping in my coat since Christmas." Caleb nodded. He didn't offer pity, he offered tea. "That's not why I came," Martha said. She met his eyes. "I came to ask if you'd teach me." "I teach you what?" "How to do this," she said, gesturing at the walls. "How to live without burning down half the forest." Caleb hesitated. The cave had saved him. Giving away its secret felt like cutting a piece out of himself. "It's not easy," he said. "You have to find the right place. 2 openings, good stone, right direction. And you have to work with it, not fight it." "I'm not afraid of hard," Martha said. "I'm afraid of freezing." Her honesty landed hard. She stayed for a week. Caleb showed her everything he knew. How the air moved, how the walls held heat, where not to block the flow. He drew pictures in the sand. He made her feel the stone when the sun warmed it. She asked careful questions and remembered the answers. At night, they talked. She told him about losing her husband, about sitting alone in a cold house with no one to speak to. He told her about Luke, about the farm, about the door closing behind him. They didn't speak of love. They spoke of survival. On the morning she left, snow drifted softly through the trees. "I found a cave in my valley," she said. "Smaller than yours, but maybe good enough." "Come back in spring," Caleb said before he could stop himself. "Tell me if it works." Martha smiled, a small, hopeful smile. "I will." When she disappeared down the trail, Caleb returned to his cave and sat by the wall, listening to the slow breath of the mountain. For the first time since he had been cast out, the warmth around him did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something he hadn't planned, but might finally be ready for. Spring came late to the mountain. The snow didn't melt all at once. It retreated in patches, leaving dark soil and bent grass behind, like the land itself was tired of winter. Caleb stepped out of the cave one morning and felt the sun on his face without the bite of cold for the first time in months. He had survived, not with fire, not with help, but with patience, stone, and trust in something larger than himself. 3 weeks later, he saw a familiar shape climbing the trail. Martha Reed. She looked stronger than before. Her coat was cleaner. Her steps were steadier. When she reached the cave, she didn't speak right away. She just smiled, wide, relieved, and almost laughing. It worked, she said. The cave stayed warm through March, even when the snow came back. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was still tight. They spent the next days working side by side, expanding the stone wall, smoothing the floor, building a second sleeping space. The cave that had once been only a refuge slowly became something else. A home. Word spread faster than Caleb expected. By summer, men from nearby valleys came asking questions. Farmers, trappers, widows with drafty cabins. Caleb showed them what he knew, not as a teacher, but as a man who had once been desperate and didn't want others to freeze the way he almost had. Some built their own shelters. Some went home with hope. Martha stayed. They married quietly that June, with Henry Cole standing witness and the mountain wind moving through the trees like music. They didn't need a church. They didn't need a town. They had warmth. They had work. They had each other. Years later, Caleb heard about Luke. The farm had failed. The winters had been too hard. Evelyn had gone back to the city. Luke died poor and alone during a bitter cold season. Caleb sat by the stone wall and listened to the cave breathe. He felt no triumph, only a distant sadness for the brother he once knew. Because the truth was simple. The man who had been thrown out into the cold had built the warmest life of all, and the man who kept the house had lost everything inside it. Caleb and Martha raised children in that cave. They taught them how to watch the wind, how to feel the stone, how to work with the world instead of against it. Long after Caleb was gone, people still climbed the ridge and felt the strange, steady warmth inside the mountain. They never knew his name, but they felt what he had learned. That rejection doesn't have to mean ruin. That being cast out doesn't have to mean being lost. That sometimes the door that closes behind you is the one that saves your life. So let me ask you, if you were forced to leave everything behind, your home, your family, your past, would you survive? Would you look for shelter? Or would you look for a new way to live? And if you found warmth where no one else believed it existed, would you keep it to yourself? Or would you share it? If this story moved you, stay with us. There are more lives like this waiting to be told. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful survival stories, true-to-life struggles, and human journeys that prove hope can grow in the coldest places. And tell us in the comments, what would you do if winter took everything from you?